All right. So, we've been talking about the future of global order, right? And you said it for some really fascinating stuff, focusing on the U.S. China relationship.
Yeah.
Specifically, this discussion from the Asia Society.
Yeah.
With Kishore Mahbubani.
Right.
And Orville Schell.
Yes.
And what I thought was so interesting is this deep dive kind of goes way beyond the headlines,
Yeah.
It's really about what's really at stake in this competition and how different parts of the world are reacting to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in, the day-to-day news, right?
Right.
But this discussion really forces us to think long-term about these huge forces that are shaping the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. And, Mahbubani, he kind of sets the stage right away.
Yeah.
With this idea of the Asian century.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying this isn't just some shift in economic power.
Right.
This is like a fundamental reorientation of global influence.
Yeah.
And to really understand this shift, he brings up this pretty amazing statistic. So he says back in the 1960s, right?
Oh, yeah.
None of the top 5 global economies were in Asia.
Wow.
Today. 3 are.
That's huge.
It's a big deal, right? And what's so fascinating about Mahbubani's argument is that this isn't some temporary thing.
Right.
He actually sees it as a return to a historical norm, after this period of Western dominance.
Yeah. I mean, for a huge chunk of human history, Asia was the center,
right.
of the world.
The economic and cultural gravity.
Exactly. And so for a lot of people outside of the West, this resurgence, it's not really surprising.
Right.
It's expected.
Totally. And he actually uses this really vivid analogy to kind of drive home this point about China specifically.
Uh-huh.
So he says, imagine China has been this quiet mouse living next to Southeast Asia, but now it's becoming an elephant.
Oh.
I mean, that image, right?
Yeah.
It really captures the magnitude of the change.
Absolutely. And that elephant, as you said, is now, doing more trade with the world. Right.
Than the United States, which is pretty remarkable.
That's a concrete indicator of their influence.
It is.
But of course, China's rise isn't without its challenges.
Right.
Shelley actually brings up this term wolf warrior diplomacy to describe China's actions on the world stage.
Okay.
They're becoming increasingly assertive.
Right.
And he points to a bunch of different examples, like disputes with Canada, Sweden, India, and others. And he particularly focuses on their actions in the South China Sea, which, as you know, is this incredibly important shipping route.
Yes.
And China's been,
building islands.
Yeah, building these artificial islands and asserting their territorial claims.
Right.
Which is, causing a lot of alarm.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, neighboring countries, the U.S., everyone's watching this very closely.
Right. And this has led to increased military activity in the region.
Absolutely.
And there's a real fear of potential conflict.
Yeah, it's definitely a tense situation. Yeah, and then Schell kind of brings it back to China's internal politics a bit.
Okay.
He seems particularly concerned about China under Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
Arguing that the country is taking a more authoritarian turn internally. And he makes this interesting comparison to Vietnam.
Okay.
Which also obviously has a communist party.
Right.
But in Schell's view, China's actions, especially in the South China Sea, along the border with India and regarding Taiwan, are way more regressive and destabilizing.
So he's basically saying that China's actions are more worrying than Vietnam's.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
So what makes China's actions more concerning in Schell's view?
Well, I think what he's suggesting is that China under Xi Jinping isn't just content with economic power. He sees them as actively trying to reshape the global order, in a way that favors their interests and their model of governance. And he's worried about what he calls Chinese, techno-authoritarianism.
Techno-authoritarianism.
Yeah, this idea that China is exporting its surveillance technology and model of internet control to other countries.
Right.
And that could potentially undermine democratic values and human rights.
Wow, okay, that's a scary thought.
It is.
But Mahbubani, he pushes back on this whole perception of China as a threat.
Yeah.
He argues that this wolf warrior image, it's largely a Western construct. And he points out that 88% of the world's population lives outside the West.
Wow, okay, that's a big number.
Right, and their view of China is much more positive.
Interesting.
He sees China's assertiveness as a natural consequence of their growing power.
Makes sense.
And a response to what they perceive as Western efforts to contain their rise. And he even kind of suggests that there's some hypocrisy in the West's criticism of China's human rights record.
Right.
While it continues to engage with countries like Vietnam, which also have questionable human rights practices.
Yeah, that's a good point. He's really challenging us to think about whose perspective we should trust.
Right.
When we're forming our own opinions about China's, like, whose narratives are shaping our understanding of this complex relationship, you know?
Yeah.
It's a good reminder to be critical.
For sure.
Of the information we consume.
Yeah.
Seek out different perspectives.
Yeah.
And question our own assumptions.
I mean, thinking back to that boat analogy, right? This seems to be like one of the first cracks appearing in this shared vessel.
It definitely highlights the deep mistrust that exists between the U.S. and China, you know?
Right.
And it comes from all these different things. There are differing political systems, disagreements over Taiwan, and this economic competition that, you know, is increasingly spilling over into security concerns.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for tension.
Totally.
And you can really feel that tension throughout this whole discussion.
Oh, for sure. And it kind of brings us to this question that I think we're going to continue to unpack in this deep dive, which is in a world where the U.S. and China are increasingly suspicious of each other, right? Suspicious of each other's motives and actions.
Yeah.
Can they actually find a way to cooperate on these huge global challenges that demand collective action?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
The million-dollar question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it really is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah. Can these two giants with such different worldviews, you know, and strategic goals, can they find common ground?
It's hard to imagine sometimes, right?
Well, Mahbubani argues that they absolutely have to.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to existential threats.
Right.
Like climate change.
Yeah.
And he uses this like really striking analogy to make this point.
Okay, let's hear it.
He says we're all on the same boat now.
Okay.
And if it sinks, everyone goes down with it.
Wow, that's powerful.
It's a powerful reminder, right?
It is.
That despite their rivalry, the U.S. and China have a shared interest in making sure the planet is habitable.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's not just climate change either, right? There are so many global challenges that require cooperation.
Holy.
Pandemics, cybersecurity threats, nuclear proliferation. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, it's a long list.
And the question is, can they overcome this deep mistrust to actually address these issues effectively?
I mean, that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating.
Absolutely.
So Mahbubani seems to think it's possible.
Okay, I'm curious to hear this.
He points to Southeast Asia.
Okay.
Specifically ASEAN.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Right, as a model for how to navigate a multipolar world.
Interesting. Okay, so how does ASEAN fit into all of this?
Well, it's this group of countries with diverse political systems and all this historical baggage.
Yeah, they've had their share of conflicts for sure.
Right, but they've managed to maintain peace and promote economic cooperation in a region that's strategically vital to both the U.S. and China.
So they're kind of threading the needle there.
Exactly. And Mahbubani highlights this really interesting dynamic.
Okay.
He says to become a leader of Vietnam, you have to be able to stand up to China and get along with China.
Wow, that's a tough balancing act.
It is, right?
It is.
And it kind of speaks to this nuanced diplomacy that's required in this complex world.
Absolutely. It suggests that you don't have to pick sides. Yeah. You can pursue your own interests while maintaining relationships with both.
It's definitely a balancing act.
It is.
But Azana shows that it can be done.
Yeah. It's an interesting model for other countries to consider.
For sure.
And even for individuals like you and me.
Right. Like, how can we apply those principles of standing up for what we believe in while also finding common ground with people we might disagree with?
It's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely food for thought.
But even as we're talking about these, you know, possibilities for cooperation, there are some serious flashpoints that could derail any progress.
Absolutely.
And both speakers agree that Taiwan is the most dangerous of them all.
Yeah, Mahbubani explains that for China, Taiwan is like this last vestige of their century of humiliation.
Right.
This period of weakness and exploitation by foreign powers.
Yeah, it's a sensitive topic for sure.
And they see reunification with Taiwan as essential to restoring their national pride and achieving their rightful place in the world.
And so any move by Taiwan towards formal independence,
right,
or any increase in U.S. military support for Taiwan could be seen by China as a red line.
Yeah, it's a situation that requires extreme caution.
Absolutely.
And sensitivity from everyone involved.
For sure. The historical context here is really important.
It is.
I mean, for China, Taiwan isn't just a territorial dispute.
Right.
It's a core part of their national identity. It's tied to their history of overcoming adversity and reclaiming their sovereignty.
It's a deeply emotional issue.
It is.
And that makes it even harder to find a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely. And then, just to add another layer of complexity.
Oh, boy.
Someone in the audience brings up the question of what happens if Trump is reelected.
Oh, wow.
In 2024.
Yeah, that question kind of hangs in the air, doesn't it?
It does. It throws a whole other wrench into things.
It adds another layer of uncertainty to this already complex situation.
And Mahbubani doesn't hold back.
Okay.
He says that most countries would be much happier with a Biden victory.
Interesting.
He suggests that Trump's foreign policy, the America First approach, has damaged America's global standing and made it harder to build trust with allies and partners.
Okay, so he's pretty clear about his preference there.
He is.
What about Schell? What does he say?
Well, Schell actually chooses not to comment directly on Trump.
Okay.
Instead, he focuses on the need for the U.S. to get its own house in order, if it wants to be an effective global leader.
Right, so regardless of who's in the White House, America needs to address its internal divisions and reaffirm its commitment to democratic values.
If it wants to lead by example and inspire others.
It's a subtle but important distinction.
It is. He seems to be saying that America's internal challenges
Right.
are as much of a threat to its global leadership
Right.
as any external rivalry.
So where does all of this leave us?
Well, we've explored this complex relationship between the U.S. and China. We've seen the opportunities for cooperation and the potential for conflict.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is, but amidst all this geopolitical maneuvering and, strategic anxiety, Mahbubani ends on a surprisingly hopeful note.
He does? What does he say?
He makes this really passionate plea for the U.S. and China to put aside their differences and focus on the existential threats facing humanity.
He's saying that ultimately we're all in this together.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really powerful how he brings us back to that boat analogy.
Right. It's a reminder that global cooperation, it's not just some, idealistic notion.
Yeah, it's a matter of survival.
Especially with these challenges like climate change. I mean, these things don't respect national borders.
Exactly. No country can solve these problems alone.
And the U.S. and China, as the world's two largest economies and the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, they have a special responsibility.
They do.
To lead the way.
It makes you think about the choices we all make.
It does.
Even in our everyday lives.
Right. Like, how can we as individuals contribute to a more sustainable future?
Yeah.
How can we promote understanding and cooperation, across cultural divides?
Those are the questions that stay with you.
They do.
Long after the conversation ends.
And that's the mark of a really impactful deep dive, isn't it?
I think so.
It sparks new ideas, challenges our assumptions, encourages us to think differently about the world.
We've explored a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, from the rise of Asia to the, complexities of U.S. China relations to this urgent need for global cooperation.
We've seen how history shapes the present, how economics and security are intertwined.
Yeah.
And how individual choices can have these ripple effects.
They can.
That impact the whole world.
It's complex.
It is.
It's challenging.
For sure.
But it's also incredibly important.
Couldn't agree more.
And, we hope this deep dive has given you a new lens.
A new way to view these issues.
Yeah, a lens that recognizes both the dangers and the possibilities that lie ahead.
Well said. So as we wrap up.
Yeah.
We want to leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
Remember Mahbubani's boat?
Oh, yeah, the boat.
We're all on it together.
We are.
So what role will you play
in
steering it towards a better future?
That's the question we hope you'll keep asking yourself.
Keep questioning, keep diving deep.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.